So I'm going to begin this video talking about something that's going to be very contentious. I struggled with it for the majority of my life, probably since I was about 14. And it's the idea of finding a compatible partner that may or may not have the same kind of background, uh, tradition, as it were. So it's almost, we are attracted to each other, we have the same likes and dislikes, our long-term goals seem to kind of align, but maybe our family traditions and backgrounds are a little bit different. So how do we go about that? So I'm going to think of this as a completely fresh new page, kind of thinking about Abel now. So we're all trying to be charitable with each other and respecting our own kind of boundaries that we're trying to build for ourselves as parents, and maybe not inviting ourselves into what our children might be kind of investigating about life. And then for children to also allow themselves to maintain boundaries, but also accept advice, maybe from their elders or like from people who've had past experiences. So I'm going to begin by saying one of the reasons that I know, like in Egypt, cousins intermarry all the time. It's very normal. And sometimes families feel comfortable doing this because they already know that, we're familiar with what our family style is. We understand what our norms are, and that might lessen the kind of conflicts we kind of come to contact with. I personally think there's truth to that, and there's also myths. Um, the myth is the more family involvement, the more conflict there actually tends to be, because you feel like the couple themselves constantly have to sacrifice, or are more likely to have to sacrifice on behalf of pleasing other people rather than themselves as a couple. So it's almost like if I am disagreeing with my mother-in-law, is it my aunt or is it my mother-in-law? And then how does my mom feel about that? And then, I have to kind of deal with that connection. And then I have to think about like, okay, well, what about me and, my cousin? Is it me and my cousin, or is it me and my husband? And then like, what are my cousins? How are they affecting this relationship? And so like that boundary, it becomes so unbelievably porous that it's like if you don't already kind of go in knowing that I've already accustomed myself to this lifestyle and this is the way we've learned to kind of understand how to navigate, then it might be very, very difficult to try to understand how to live that way. So I bring this up because I think two videos back, I was talking about how sometimes the Quran actually mentions the importance of inviting yourself into that conflict and understanding how to set boundaries and how to be firm around them, or like finding ways to reinforce them. So the story we have is Muhammad and his uncles. So they were the ones that forced him out of his home in Mecca. And it's kind of interesting, the story, because there was a time where the persecution got really, really bad. And it mm, I think it might have been within like 9 or 10 years after so he might have been around 50. And what happened was the nobility, like they almost took a representative from each clan and decided that they were going to kind of surround his home. And the first thing that happens when he comes out of his house was that they were going to all attack him. That way, not one person is held accountable for his death, as it were, or for him, disappearing. So even though they had kind of planned to do that, God somehow inspired that his cousin Ali would be with him, who was, I guess, would be about 20 years old at that point. And he took his spot in his bed, and then somehow, while they were maybe standing there, they fell asleep. And so Muhammad was able to kind of leave and escape their notice. And then when they went inside and kind of wondered, like, where he's not coming out of his home, they found that it was his cousin that was there, and he was able to escape and travel to the city of the Prophet, which is known as Medina, and kind of try to reside there and build a safe haven for his followers and himself. So this is almost to say that even though they're a family of his that are known to have their prestige, they weren't very open-minded. And even though he had family members within his actual family, like his immediate family or relatives that supported him, they still fought against each other. So he had two uncles actually that tried to support him, and two that were staunch enemies, and he kind of just had to deal with that. And then there was a year known as the Year of Sadness, where he lost his grandfather, his uncle, and I believe his wife, all in a very short span of time. So it was like a way of saying, like, I lost all the supports I had in the world. And God revealed the story of, it's called the dawn, or the, like that period after dawn and before noon, almost to reassure the prophet and say, like, I am the one that created you and fashioned your life in this way to help you to remember the weak, and not to uh, almost abandon them, or kind of give them a cold shoulder, or as though they're not in need of guidance, or some kind of support in the world over and above what God offers, without really needing profits. So it's almost to say the reason we are in the world is that we are there to kind of support each other. We're not uh, islands, as it were. So, with all that in mind, I I don't I don't really know. Like, I'm thinking about right now, when I was growing up, I used to kind of almost lament that my parents were the first ones from their family, respectively, to live in Canada. I was like, we'd visit Egypt, and I think, I know it'd be cool if we had cousins that lived here. They all look like they get along, and they all understand each other's kind of culture. And now that I've grown up, and I have siblings who've had kids, so I've got nieces and nephews who are anywhere between, I think, well, like infancy and maybe 12 years of age. And they're all going to be kind of going through maybe some of the ideas that I have been going through, except maybe without wondering about extended family, because they have all their cousins too. So the conflict now might be, well, what if we don't want to marry within like our cousins? We just want to be friends or like family. Like, are we allowed to venture out? And then to what degree are we going to be allowed to wonder about other families with different backgrounds that might not be as closely approximated to what we're kind of accustomed to? So I'm going to kind of just leave it at that, because that's really, um, I feel like talking about it is almost taking away from kids' exploration, uh, in wondering how to kind of involve themselves in this way of thinking. And I don't want to prime their mind or their thinking in any way, and almost allow them to understand, like, well, what argument do I have that would allow me to say that, yeah, I want to, get involved with somebody from a tradition that looks like ours, but we don't maybe practice in the same way. So this is something that's going to kind of remind us of Romeo and Juliet, and maybe that can inform how intermarrying within families and cousins can create that kind of feud where it's like, well, why is my kid any better than your kid? Or kind of the same family, but for some reason, one ends up being a little bit more, devastated than another, and it's always the kids that tend to suffer. So if we want to be charitable, then you can think, so okay, from a parent's perspective, we want to be kind of charitable, meaning we want to allow our kids to kind of go into the world and see what they make of it. And for ourselves as well, we almost have to think, okay, to what degree am I comfortable kind of holding back and not trying to enforce some of the parenting styles that I was maybe parented with? So uh, I don't know how to say that in a postmodern world, it's difficult to judge what a criteria would be for monotheism. It's more, what are we, and it's so difficult to say without having like a case study. So if I was to say, I'm a 35-year-old, let's say, and I've been so focused on my career, I haven't had any time to actually think about like a romantic partner. And maybe I meet somebody at work, and I decide, you know, maybe, and I am a woman, and maybe I think, I don't know, like, what your background is. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about this at work. Like, what's the protocol for that? In my last video, I kind of, like, in a humorous kind of tongue in cheek, I posted that link with American Pie just to show how, in this culture, North America and in Europe, that's very normal. But within these traditional families, and as kids of immigrant parents, we want to look at that and say that should be normal, and we should be able to kind of interact with other people without feeling like we're creating them as an other. But then how do we convince our parents of that if they don't want to acknowledge a postmodern lens, or don't even understand how to think about it yet? So I don't know. I remember having this discussion with my family about 2 or 3 years ago, and trying to say something along the lines of, if we align with Ibrahim and saying we are all inclining to truth, and we live in a world right now where it's difficult to say that anybody who is born into, let's say, a Muslim family, or wants to say that they're practicing according to what the religion kind of prescribes, is any better than somebody who maybe just hasn't been given a chance to kind of contemplate that yet. is any better or worse is really difficult for me. So if we just say that we're all kind of inclining to truth, and maybe, two couples who kind of find some kind of common ground that they want to get to know each other further, like why create that as a barrier and say, one person shouldn't um, be compatible because, and then label kind of like a religious reason, as it were. So if you look in the Quran, it does say that it's better that people of the book do intermarry, because it's almost like they're almost already acknowledging that there is a source in the world that does inspire, and it comes in this form. And in spite of it coming in this form, it's very open to interpretation. So then you have to say, okay, well, maybe between these two couples, like they have to understand, failing that we're able to kind of reach some kind of agreement on something, what is it that we can fall back on? So that could be an option. Basically, the sort of resonating idea around intermarrying like that is be careful of people who ascribe partners with God, because in that way it becomes difficult to align. So if I'm someone who says, I'm only devoted to God and I'm building an ethic around that, and then maybe I'm with somebody who says, my tradition suggests, and then they have like a list of things that may not be based in a tradition, as it were, but from a traditional worldview may look unethical, then you're kind of stuck. So I mentioned sorcery as being one of them, and like kind of dabbling with jinn and kind of raising the dead. I don't really know anything about it other than that one does seem to be focused kind of on fire and maybe and smoke and jinn, and maybe something to do with Zoroastrianism. Maybe not. I don't know. People who, like, we can think of Shiva, maybe, who used to worship the sun. I don't really know. I know that there were times where companions did come from kind of the Byzantine Empire to visit with the Prophet, and on their journey, they came across kind of subcultures from these different ways of thinking. And each time they'd ask about a prophet, they'd say, no, 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 it's not here. You'd have to kind of visit this way. So it's almost like maybe there was a progressive way of reaching this kind of final understanding of oneness in the universe. And having that is almost like a way of saying, okay, why don't we try to get to know each other? And then in the meantime, try to understand how we can align and kind of common understanding about the universe. And then that could be kind of like a basic sort of structure to kind of build on. And the reason I say this is because it's very disheartening when you see people who are uh, kind of interested in each other and they already have that kind of initial attraction. And then to say that we can't uh, be kind of people who syncretize or kind of learn from each other and try to understand how to establish like a new way of existing in the world that is still going to be monotheistic, still inclining to, we want to not create anything uh, over and above understanding like oneness. And we can only do that by trying to understand how to meet each other halfway, like be pluralistic. And then we don't have these cultures that build boundaries and like build another and then, have a hard time understanding each other. And so it's just like, it's an opportunity for creating so much diversity and so much common understanding. And I know, I say this with so much sadness because I know, coming from countries that speak Arabic, sometimes the idea is, if you're talking about somebody who doesn't speak Arabic, then, it's probably not likely, because we want our kids to speak Arabic because it's the language of the Quran and we want to be able to understand our kids and all of that. And I mean, ideally, yeah, I can see that being something that people hold as like an ideal. But at the same time, the Prophet, he mentioned in his, like, before his passing, which is like people would say is like his will, like it's the final thing, like his 63 years of living, if we were to kind of gain anything from his existence, it was like this final kind of testament. And he said that there's no preference to an Arab speaker versus someone who has a foreign tongue, so it doesn't speak Arabic but speaks any other language, and nor anything to do with race. So, and there's a pretty long list of all the different characteristics that people can embody. And what he said at the end was, the only thing that distinguishes one person from another is the kind of piety they have about God and how that informs how they deal with other people. So if we have that foundation, and if we are true to understanding the Quran and wanting that to be a goal for our kids, um, of, these hybrid families, as it were, then all these sort of excuses, I'm going to call them, should fall away. And I almost maybe say this, and I don't want to soften the edges. Like I want to be kind of blunt and blatant about it, so that people can understand that this is like a serious issue that we, as especially having kids who right now maybe second or third generation from like immigrant parents, are probably going, and especially with like fluidity in understanding gender and all these new constructs, they're not going to remember anything of like, the almost box-like values that maybe our grandparents had, which is, we're new to this way of thinking, and we have to kind of conform to a certain tradition. Like the world's changed so much in just like 60 years. So coming to that understanding, it feels like it's like a global effort. It's not just one community over another. So I don't want to be picking just on Muslims, but I do feel like I needed to because of the whole Arabic thing. And then Arabic is it's a very nuanced language, but I have friends who studied it, and I know a lot of people who have become fluent in it and can speak it and understand it very well. And it's becoming something that is more accessible. So there's like so many schools around the world that that aim to help people speak Arabic, mostly with the intention that when they do read scripture and they want to read it in the original language, they can be kind of supported in a way that gives them more access to what the meanings and the nuances of the scripture can be. So I'm just going to leave it at that. It's kind of a short video, but I don't know. It's just a kind of a sore topic for me because I remember when I was in university, this was when I was 18. So back in 2001, this was something that I came up against where people who were interested in each other, but their respective families for one reason or another didn't agree. It led to so much mental health distress, right? And so you think, school's already very difficult. You're already trying to align with like a community or a niche that aligns with you as like someone who's like a budding identity. And then you think, and this is such a good opportunity because there's so much diversity everywhere and everyone's kind of with that same goal alongside whatever they're studying. And to be able to find somebody that sort of aligns with you and that you can build together with is like, why not try to investigate that and try to flourish and like nurture that together. And maybe now, like post-secondary education isn't as popular maybe as it was 23 years ago, but it's still something that, with social media and people being able to network in like a variety of ways now, I would hope that these kind of boundaries and maybe restrictions or reservations are almost put aside and hopefully overcome with time and with more discussion. So I'm going to leave it at that. I had one kind of reminder that some of the ways that we can understand the Quran sometimes can be a little bit um, off key, but not off key. So it's to say that they're kind of like Sufi renditions or kind of metaphysical understandings of something that's kind of normalized within the tradition. So if we think of life that way and we say, uh, if you go to a circle of knowledge, for example, like a Bible study, maybe the preacher or the minister will open the Quran and he'll open like a known tafsir translator of hermeneutics of the Quran, and he'll kind of elaborate on, this is what the people after the Prophet's time by, a certain amount of years understood of these meanings with the context, and then they'll give kind of like maybe they'll try to give like a contemporary context to what it all means. And so one person had mentioned that uh, some people have such a reverence for how God accounts for an intention and how we think about people because they've almost built such an ethic with how they hold themselves accountable that they almost worry that if I have a negative thought about somebody, I wonder what that brings into the universe. So they would actually go and like apologize to that person and say, I had this bad thought about you. I hope you forgive me. And it's like you haven't even brought it into the universe, as it were. Like you just thought about it and you're kind of like scrupulous about like I hope this doesn't actually affect you in a negative way. So please forgive me. So in that realm, like you can see now like the extreme that this can have. Like you don't have to have a language to understand that. That's just a person who's understand an ethical way of being and they're trying to kind of align with it. And regardless of who it is, they're just that careful. So I have this one verse that I'm just going to leave at the end here, and it says, establish prayer at the two ends of the day and at the approaching of the night. Indeed, good deeds do away with misdeeds. And this is a reminder for those who want to remember or who remember. So this is kind of neat because there's a chapter called The Compassionate where God says he is the Lord of the two moons and the two suns. So, or the two west and the two east. And sometimes you think, like, what does that mean? Like, there's not two earths. But it's kind of cool if you think about it, because if you're on one side of the earth and on the other side, you know, it's almost to say on the east, you're going to have a moon, it would seem, right? Like from the primitive point of view. And then on on the west, you'd have the moon, but you don't think that they have the same moon, like as the earth is moving. So when you think of the two ends of the day and the two ends of the night, it could be, one person, like in Australia, for example, they're experiencing, I think they're like 15 hours ahead of us. So if they're having, like, they have their end of the day as we're having our morning. So already there's, like, you see how it's like a double existence. So you kind of wonder what is that parallel that this person might have been speaking to? Like, I don't know if my effects or the effect of my thoughts don't impact you, but could they impact somebody else? And then how, like, that seems really, really extreme. And we want to draw back from that, which is to create a postmodern world that wouldn't actually create a system that holds people account in that specific way, but allows for them to want that and to choose it for themselves if they do choose. And it's a rare population. It's probably very, very, very small relative to the whole world. But it just says something about what our intention is and how and why God rewards up to like 700 from a reward being equated with 10 rewards, and then from that up to 700, meaning, the extent that you're scrupulous about how you interact with other people and how you're careful about being charitable with them and their emotions and how they perceive their differences, is a degree that you will have success in facilitation in your life.